The Marshall Plan Paradox: Why America Rewarded the Guilty After World War II. You know what's strange about justice? Sometimes the people who helped commit crimes end up being the ones we need to solve them. And nowhere is this more true than what happened after World War II, when American corporations that had armed, fueled, and profited from the Nazi war machine were not only forgiven, but became the cornerstone of Europe's reconstruction. This isn't a conspiracy, it's documented policy, and understanding why it happened reveals something uncomfortable about how power actually works in the modern world. Let me take you back to May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The Nazis are defeated, the concentration camps are liberated, the full horror of the Holocaust is becoming public knowledge. American soldiers are coming home, and in Washington, D.C., policymakers are facing a crisis that most history books gloss over. Europe is destroyed, not just Germany. Britain is bankrupt, France is in ruins, Italy's infrastructure is decimated. The Soviet Union has lost 27 million people and is occupying half of Europe, and everyone's asking the same question: what do we do now? Here's what most people don't realize. The Marshall Plan, officially called the European Recovery Program, wasn't just about being generous, it was about preventing Soviet expansion. Secretary of State George Marshall announced it in June 1947. 16 countries participated. Over 4 years, the United States transferred more than $13 billion. That's over $170 billion in today's money. It rebuilt factories, restored railroads, stabilized currencies, and created the economic foundation for what we now call the European Union. History remembers it as one of America's finest moments, and it was. But there's a part of this story that makes people deeply uncomfortable. To rebuild Europe, America needed industrial capacity, factories, machinery, technical expertise, logistical systems. And the companies that had all of this, the ones that had just spent 6 years building trucks for the Wehrmacht, making synthetic fuel for the Luftwaffe, and providing technology that made the Holocaust industrially efficient, Ford, General Motors, IBM, Standard Oil, DuPont, ITT, these weren't small players. They were the backbone of American industrial might, and they had German subsidiaries that had been critical to the Nazi war effort.
So the American government faced a choice. Option 1, prosecute these companies, seize their assets, break them up, make an example that collaborating with genocidal regimes has consequences. Option 2, use them, leverage their capacity, their expertise, their infrastructure to rebuild Europe before the Soviets take over. Idealism versus pragmatism, justice versus realpolitik, and pragmatism won. It always does when the stakes are high enough. Let's look at what actually happened. The Nuremberg trials are famous. Goering, Hess, Speer, the top Nazis faced justice. What's less known is that there were subsequent trials. The industrialist trials prosecuted executives from IG Farben, Krupp, and Flick, German companies that used slave labor, produced Zyklon B, and armed the Reich. 24 IG Farben executives were tried, 13 convicted. The longest sentence? 8 years. Most served less. By 1951, all were released, and IG Farben's assets? Divided into BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, companies that still exist today. But American companies? Different story. Ford's German subsidiary, Ford Werke, used forced labor from concentration camps, built trucks that carried soldiers across Europe. The company maintained ties throughout the war. After 1945, no executives were prosecuted. Instead, Ford received contracts under the Marshall Plan to supply vehicles for European reconstruction. They got paid to rebuild what they had helped destroy. General Motors, Opel subsidiary, same thing. Produced half of Germany's trucks during the war, used slave labor. After the war, GM sued the US government for $33 million, claiming Allied bombing had damaged their German factories. And they won. American taxpayers compensated GM for damage done to factories that built Nazi war machines. IBM's role is particularly chilling. Their punch card technology was used in concentration camps to track prisoners, organize deportations, and manage extermination schedules. IBM's German subsidiary Dehomag maintained these machines throughout the war. New York headquarters collected royalties. After the war, IBM wasn't prosecuted. They weren't even investigated properly. Instead, they became a major contractor for the Marshall Plan, providing data processing systems for reconstruction efforts. The same technology that organized genocide now helped organize recovery. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Why did this happen? The conventional answer is the Cold War, and that's partly true. By 1947, the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was crumbling. Winston Churchill had delivered his Iron Curtain speech. Stalin was consolidating control in Eastern Europe. Greece and Turkey were facing communist insurgencies. The Truman Doctrine committed America to containing Soviet expansion, and that meant Western Europe had to be rebuilt quickly, effectively, and in a way that made capitalism look better than communism. But there's a deeper reason, and it's about how power actually works. These corporations weren't just convenient, they were powerful. They had political connections. They lobbied Congress. They employed thousands of American workers. They contributed to campaigns. Breaking them up or prosecuting executives would have been politically devastating. The Roosevelt and Truman administrations knew this, so they made a calculation. We need these companies more than we need symbolic justice. Consider the timeline. In 1945, there was momentum for accountability. The Senate's Truman Committee had investigated war profiteering. Journalists were exposing corporate collaboration with the Nazis. Public opinion supported consequences. But by 1947, the narrative shifted. The focus wasn't on punishing those who had helped Hitler, it was on stopping Stalin. And in that context, American corporations with German ties weren't villains anymore, they were assets. The Marshall Plan required specific things. Steel production had to restart, chemical industries needed to resume, transportation networks had to be rebuilt. Who knew how to do this in Germany? The same executives who had run these industries under the Nazis. Many were kept in place. Denazification programs were rolled back. Former Nazi industrialists were rehabilitated because they had technical expertise that couldn't be easily replaced. American companies facilitated this. They provided cover. If Ford or GM was doing business with these people, it couldn't be that bad, right?
Alfred Krupp. His company made artillery, tanks, and munitions for the Wehrmacht, used slave labor extensively. He was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 12 years. His property was ordered confiscated. But in 1951, U.S. High Commissioner John McCloy commuted his sentence and restored his property. Why? Because Krupp's steelworks were essential for European recovery, and American policy had changed. We needed production, not punishment. This wasn't unique to Germany. In Japan, similar dynamics played out. War criminals were released. The Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates were initially targeted for dissolution, but were ultimately preserved because they were needed for reconstruction and to counter communist influence in Asia. Unit 731, which conducted horrific biological experiments, saw many of its scientists granted immunity in exchange for their research data. The pattern was consistent. When justice conflicted with strategic interests, strategy won. Now let's talk about what this meant in practice. The Marshall Plan worked brilliantly in economic terms. By 1952, industrial production in Western Europe exceeded pre-war levels. Living standards rose, democratic governments stabilized, the threat of communist takeover receded. NATO was formed. The foundation for decades of peace and prosperity in Western Europe was laid. From a policy perspective, it was a triumph, and using existing corporate infrastructure was crucial to that success. But there was a cost. and that cost was accountability. The message sent was clear: if you're powerful enough and useful enough, you can escape consequences. This wasn't lost on corporate executives. The lesson learned was that collaboration with authoritarian regimes, if done through proper legal structures and foreign subsidiaries, carries minimal risk, especially if the geopolitical situation changes in your favor. Let me give you a counterfactual. What if the United States had chosen differently? What if they had prosecuted American executives who knowingly profited from the Nazi regime? What if they had seized corporate assets used in war crimes? What if they had made an example that would echo through generations? Would the Marshall Plan have failed? Probably not. It would have been harder, slower, more expensive, but European reconstruction would have happened. The question is whether the symbolic and legal precedent would have been worth the cost. And this is where we get into moral philosophy. There's a school of thought called consequentialism that judges actions by their outcomes. By that measure, the decision to prioritize reconstruction over prosecution was correct. Europe was saved. Democracy prevailed. The Cold War was eventually won. Millions of people lived better lives than they would have otherwise. The ends justified the means. But there's another perspective, deontological ethics, which argues that some principles are inviolable regardless of outcomes. Justice is one of them. If we say genocide is the ultimate crime, then those who enabled it must face consequences. Otherwise, the principle means nothing. And when you sacrifice principles for expedience once, you establish a precedent. You teach the next generation that power matters more than justice, that being useful makes you immune, that history forgives winners. This tension plays out in international relations constantly. We condemn human rights abuses in countries we don't like and overlook them in countries we need. We sanction some dictatorships and sell weapons to others. Saudi Arabia gets arms deals despite Yemen. China gets trade despite Xinjiang. Russia gets pipelines despite Ukraine, until suddenly it doesn't. The calculus is always the same. How useful are you to us right now, and can we afford to alienate you?
The Marshall Plan set a template. It showed that corporations can participate in atrocities, and if the strategic situation shifts, they can become partners in recovery. This isn't cynicism, it's observation. And it explains a lot about why corporate accountability for human rights violations remains so weak today. Think about modern parallels. After the Cold War ended, American companies rushed into China, helped build their industrial base, transferred technology, looked the other way on labor practices, environmental standards, and political repression. Why? Because the market was enormous and the profits were staggering. Now, as US-China relations deteriorate, suddenly there's talk of decoupling, of supply chain security, of human rights concerns. But for 3 decades, those concerns were secondary to economic growth. Just like in 1947, strategic calculus drives moral calculation. Or consider the 2008 financial crisis. Banks engaged in reckless behavior that nearly collapsed the global economy. The response? Bailouts, because these institutions were too big to fail. Some executives lost jobs, some companies paid fines, but systemic accountability, minimal. Why? Because the priority was stabilizing the system, not punishing those responsible. The Marshall Plan logic again. We need these institutions more than we need justice. So what do we take from this? First, understand that the Marshall Plan's success came with a moral compromise. American corporations that profited from Nazi Germany were not only spared consequences, but became instruments of European recovery. This was a deliberate choice, made for strategic reasons that proved effective but established dangerous precedents. Second, recognize that this pattern repeats. When powerful institutions commit wrongs, accountability depends on whether punishing them serves larger strategic goals. If they're useful, they're protected. This isn't conspiracy, it's realpolitik, and it's how international systems have always worked.
Third, the question for any society is whether this is acceptable. Can we build systems where justice isn't always subordinate to strategy, where corporations face meaningful consequences regardless of their utility? Or is this naive? Is the world too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on powerful institutions to hold them truly accountable? There's no easy answer. The Marshall Plan saved Europe, but it also taught corporations that collaboration with evil regimes carries manageable risk. Both things can be true, and grappling with that contradiction is necessary if we want to understand not just history, but how power works today. Because the same dynamics that protected Ford and IBM in 1947 protect companies operating in authoritarian markets now. Different era, same logic. Same uncomfortable truth that usefulness matters more than righteousness when the stakes are high enough. The Marshall Plan wasn't just about rebuilding Europe, it was about choosing what kind of precedent to set. And we're still living with that choice. Understanding it doesn't give us easy answers, but it might give us clearer questions about what we're willing to accept and what we should demand from institutions that shape our world.